Right, let's go and look now at some biblical or historical challenges. So, is this consistent? Is this cloth consistent with the descriptions of the burial cloths in the New Testament accounts?
And well, I mean, the New Testament doesn't really talk about burial cloths aside from this one. But if you look at the Jewish customs of burial at the time, it is at variance with this. And so the Shroud of Turin is taken as this is taken as evidence both for and against the Shroud's authenticity. Some people look at it and say, well, gee, people at the time weren't buried like this in this kind of shroud. And other people will say, well, if people weren't buried like this, then if the shroud was a fake, why would the forger ever start with this from the gospel narratives and produce an image like this? So my possible explanation for why the shroud is the way it is that the burial had to be done in haste. If you remember the whole story after the death of Christ, and Joseph of Arimathea comes to Pilate to get the body, and this, of course, is sometime in the afternoon.
This is the afternoon of the Friday, the Jewish Passover.
Correct, and of course, Sabbath, Saturday is the Sabbath, and the Sabbath begins at sundown. So they wanted to get this, and this, of course, was the Passover, which was a special Sabbath, and they wanted to get this burial done before the Sabbath started. So it was only two guys, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. They hurry up and they bury Christ in Joseph's tomb. And probably Joseph grabbed a cloth that he had available, which may not have been an actual shroud that would be typically used to bury somebody. And they didn't have time to wash the body either. And that would typically have been done in the case of a burial.
But they had to get all this done before.
Yeah.
We imagine them doing this at dusk on the Friday.
Exactly. So they're trying to hurry to try and get this all finished and done to before the Sabbath started, because what happens is if you don't do this, then you were ritually unclean.
Which would have been unthinkable to good Jews like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea.
Well, you have to remember that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were both members of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
This is the Jewish intelligentsia, the high order of Jewish scribes at that time. So, they were very conscious of this sort of thing.
Now, there's another cloth known as the Sudarium of Oviedo.
Yes.
What is it?
Well, this is a cloth that was it's stained with blood, and it was alleged to be the cloth that covered Jesus, the face of Christ, after his crucifixion. And it may have been what we call the napkin, or that's referred to in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 20. And the Sudarium was brought. Actually, it has a much more detailed history, or not much more definitive history than the shroud does itself. It was brought to Spain in the 7th century, and it's been kept in the Spanish town of Oviedo ever since that time.
So it's got a provenance going back to the 600s.
Yes, way back. And the Sudarium in 1999 was studied, and the team examining it concluded that the Sudarium and the shroud both covered the same head. The bloodstains match up.
And they were both AB blood, from what I remember.
Yes.
So I think the background here is that when Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea went to take Christ off the cross, not to cover his head would have been disrespectful in Jewish culture.
Yes.
So the head had to be covered. So you can imagine them putting this cloth on while he was still on the cross, and then taking him down and transferring him to the tomb. And I think it's the Gospel of John that records that the headcloth was left separately from the shroud. There's no image on the Sudarium, is there, on the headcloth?
No, there's no image.
But that's consistent with the idea that the headcloth would have been taken off when they got to the tomb. It would have been disgraceful for the face to be shown in public when it went from the cross to the tomb, so they covered the face But then
Right.
when they put the body into the shroud, that would be taken off and folded up neatly. And another nice touch there is when a dinner guest of this time was nipping out to the loo, they would fold their napkin neatly, meaning they were going to return.
Right, exactly.
Whereas if they just chucked it on the table, that means, oh, I'm off, mate, Make what you want of that. It's just
Right.
that's just me talking out loud.
Okay, there you go.
Now, a more serious issue to my mind is Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took, from what I remember, is about 50 pounds of myrrhs and aloes to anoint the body with. I'm a bit confused about that because we know that the women on the first day of the week, which will be the Sunday morning, took spices to anoint the body with. So why would they have had to do that if Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had already put myrrh and aloes on the body? I mean, did they run out of time, or do you think was that actually used, the myrrh and aloes actually used?
Well, we don't know. We don't really know. It mentions the fact that these two guys did take the myrrh and aloes with them.
Yeah.
And presumably, and of course, this was very customary to put myrrh. Myrrh was used very extensively in Old Testament times, all throughout the Arab world.
Yep.
Actually, it was used also as a because they didn't wash very often, because they didn't have very much water, and so there's a lot of body smells.
For sure.
And so they would use myrrh and some of these spices to cover up body smells, BO and stuff like that. So they would use myrrh to cover the smell of the dead body, and I'm not sure exactly why the women thought it was necessary, but usually this was typically washing and anointing the body was usually a female thing. I mean,
the women would have presumably been told by Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea that the body hadn't been washed.
Yes, and who knows what they said to these women? We don't know.
If there were myrrh and aloes on there, then because the body had to be washed as part of Jewish culture, then they would have had to been removed and fresh anointings put on, presumably. So it does make sense. But to allow the body to be buried without being washed would have been unconscionable.
Right. And especially the body of Christ, where they were respected.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyone that was respected, but yeah, especially the followers would have. It would have been unthinkable that they would leave the body unwashed, but they couldn't wash it on the Sabbath. But there are some accounts from the shroud was in Constantinople, and some people did say it smelled of myrrh. There's actually written records of that. So.
Yes.
But there again, it could have been washed at many times.
Right. So as we'll see when we cover the historical account, the shroud did come to Constantinople at some point. It was kept in the imperial relic treasury, and there is an account of the shroud being smelling of myrrh. But we don't know if the shroud is washed or dipped in oils, and whether that myrrh smell would have been removed. But in any case, now there apparently is no odor to the shroud.
No, and people that were custodians of the shroud at different periods of history would have treated it in ways that was respectful for their culture at the time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that might have involved washing it. Sometimes it might have involved anointing it. We don't fully understand these things. Mm-hmm. The height of the man on the shroud seems to be, it's hard to tell because of the bent posture, but estimates vary between 5'11" and 6'1". A bit tall for men of the time, for Jewish men of the time.
Yes, and that's an objection to some people. Some people see this as an objection because most of the guys at that time were shorter. But the Bible, as most literature at that time indicated, it really doesn't detail the appearance of Jesus, and it doesn't tell how tall he was, and it doesn't say this about anybody, about how tall anybody was.
No, we don't know what Paul looked like. Was he bald? Did he have hair?
Exactly.
We don't know what any of the apostles looked like, or indeed any of the women. We know nothing of the physical appearances.
Correct.
Apart from people with leprosy, for example, where it's relevant.
Right. So this picture of Solomon, this popular picture of Christ that Solomon did, may not be what Jesus looked like, other than the using the shroud as a model.
Yeah. We might come on to the artistic history as well, which is quite interesting. Concern has been expressed about the formation of the image in regard to the way that the body was wrapped in the cloth.
Yes.
What's the objection there, Rich?
Well, this is one of the most serious objections in my mind, because the cloth would presumably have gone over not only on the top of the body but also over the shoulders. But there's nothing on the cloth that has anything on the shoulder sides. It only shows the image on the top of the body and the bottom of the body. And so presumably the cloth was rested on the sides. Maybe was not wrapped, but at least it would rest on the sides. But there's no image on the sides of the cloth. So that is that people have raised that as a challenge to the authenticity of the shroud.
If we go back to the radiation idea, there's many things about the possible radiation hypothesis that we don't understand in terms of radiation directionality.
Correct. And it may be that if it was indeed radiation, that all the radiation was unidirectional, did not go off in all directions. So again, this is another argument from silence that's saying, it shoulda, coulda, woulda gone in all directions, and why didn't it have this? But we don't know for sure exactly how the resurrection worked or what exactly caused this radiation, if it was indeed radiation, to occur, and how it worked.
So near where I live in the north of England, there's an archaeological site on the Roman wall called Vindolanda.
Okay.
And the found organic remains there in anaerobic conditions under clay, writing tablets, sandals, belts, pieces of cloth. And I can understand that because it's completely anaerobic, there's no oxygen at all. But how credible is it that linen could survive for 2,000 years in a fully aerobic environment?
Well, that is a challenge, and that's another challenge that people have raised. However, it was actually, as we'll see when we get to the history, that it was actually put in an anaerobic environment for quite a while during its early years, for quite a number of hundreds of years. But there are many instances of ancient fabrics and textiles that have survived, and even some of them have some of the color that was there intact. And there's actually instances of ancient Egyptian Coptic textiles that have been discovered in tombs, and dating either around the time of Christ and sometimes even before. So even though it does seem amazing that a shroud would survive all down through the centuries since the time of Christ, it looks like it is possible.
Personally, I've seen textiles that are 1,000 years older than the shroud. I've seen 3,000-year-old textiles wrapping mummies in the British Museum. Anyone can walk in and see them.
Exactly.
They are there. I've seen those bandages with my own eyes. They're in a glass case, but they are 3,000 years old, and there's no question about. In fact, there's examples that are older than 3,000 years old.
From mummies, yes, very true.
Yeah. Shall we do a bit of a chronology of the shroud? The idea that to try and construct a provenance is difficult, and as we've said, we can't be definitive before about 1355. But there is a highly credible chronology of the history of the shroud, isn't there, that goes basically from the time of the crucifixion. Yes, there is, and we should allege here that for those that doubt the shroud, we cannot again prove anything historical. No. So what we're doing here is we're looking at historical evidence that what people have said and written, and that's the best we can do. But there is a consistent, coherent narrative, a linear narrative. But there is a narrative. There is a narrative. Yeah. So if we look at it, the shroud starts in around 33 AD. Yeah.
Jesus is crucified, buried by Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea.
Yep.
Joseph's, it was his cloth and his tomb. So Jesus then rises from the dead, and when the disciples enter the empty tomb, they see the burial cloths according to the Gospels. However, we don't know what happened to those burial cloths. There's nothing in the New Testament that tells us what happened to them. Presumably, they may have been given back to Joseph of Arimathea, or possibly to some of the other disciples.
I mean, there is a disciple that went into the tomb who saw and believed.
Yes.
Can't quite remember which one it was now, but...
Well, that was John.
It was John, yeah.
So Peter comes first.
That's right. Peter and John were running, weren't they? That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if Joseph went on to be buried in the same tomb. It doesn't matter. It's an irrelevance, but it's just curious.
Well, there are at least two different tomb locations in Jerusalem where, and because the Catholic Church has alleged that the Church of the Annunciation was where Jesus' tomb was.
Church of the Holy Sepulchre, yeah.
Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. And then there's also the Garden Tomb.
The General Gordon site, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, and I've been to those. Frankly, I think the Garden Tomb seems to make a little bit more sense, but again, there's no proving it one way or the other.
There is that really uncanny Golgotha skull on the side of the hill, isn't there?
There is.
It really does look like a skull.
So you've been there too?
Yeah. I've been to both sites, and
okay.
Yeah, I have told a story of my account of the Garden Tomb, but I'm going to skip on that for now. I did have a strange experience. I'll tell you about it briefly.
Okay.
It was 4:30. I was in the Garden Tomb. I was 30 yards from the tomb. It was about to close down for the day, and I saw a flash inside the tomb.
Cool.
And I thought, flash photography. And I thought, but it's not quite right. So I fixed my eyes on the tomb. I walked straight towards it. Didn't take my eyes off it. Went in, and there was no one there. And I remember the way the flash curved round the doorway. And I thought, just a minute, John, just a minute. Get this clear in your head. So I went through the whole thing in my head. I was 44 years old. I was in Jerusalem. I was on my own. I did see this flash. I went through it all. And I know I saw that flash. Now, whether that was an hallucination, I don't know. But my perceptual system saw that flash. It's not a fake memory. I went through it at the time in great detail. Now, having looked at the historical details, I think the evidence for the Constantine's mother, who was it, Helena?
Yes, she was the one that established the church.
Yeah, I think her evidence is probably slightly stronger, but and the evidence that the Garden Tomb predates the New Testament era is fairly strong. But that's my experience. Make what you want of it. I still don't know what to make of it, but
okay.
There you go. Anyway, rapidly passing on to more concrete areas. So it seems that there was something called the image of Edessa, in Edessa, yes, which is in southern Turkey, around by about 57 AD, so within a decade or two of the crucifixion.
Well, it's actually a little bit before that.
Right.
There's a King Abgar the Fifth of Edessa.
Yes.
And he had a disease. I think he had a foot disease.
A what?
And
what disease?
A disease of the feet.
Blood disease, yeah.
Yeah, and he what he did is he appealed. He had heard about this miracle working Christ, and so he sends to Jerusalem. Edessa is I'd say, 200, 300 miles from Jerusalem. Edessa is in southern Turkey.
Yeah, so it's 4, 5, 6 day journey, really.
Correct. And so he requests that something be brought to him to heal him. And the story is, this is backed up by documents. I don't remember the names of them now. If you look at my articles, I can reference them. But supposedly the shroud was brought to Edessa by either Thomas or Thaddeus, who were two of the disciples of Christ, at the request of this king. and he was miraculously healed of his disease, presumably by the power of the shroud. So some people would, of course, challenge that, but what they can't challenge is that Edessa became a Christian city.
That's archaeological and written record. That is known for sure.
Yes, so that's indisputable.
Yeah.
And I forget the name of the book again, but there's a book that was written by Edessa, the city of Christ, that records this. And there was a mosaic tile that was made of the face of the shroud that was known as the Keramion, and this was placed over the city gate. And this was often done over city gates. They would place a statue or an image of the city god. And so or the deity or the divinity that basically protected the city. Yeah. Yes. And so when you came to the city, you would bow down or give homage in some sort, or salute or whatever this image. So the Keramion was the image of Christ, and this was placed over the city gate in place of any kind of pagan symbol. Now, what happens is that the shroud and this tile, may have been the model used for the future pictures of Christ, because eventually what happens is the people in Syria became the main Christian artists that depict Christ. The 57 date that you referred to, what happened was that Manu the Sixth became the king of Edessa, and he reverted the city to paganism. Right. And so the shroud and the Keramion were hidden in the city walls to protect them from destruction. And apparently the location, they were forgotten. And so the shroud and the Keramion, they basically were stored in the city walls for hundreds of years.
Right, so it would be around from about 38 to 57, and then it was hidden away.
Correct.
In 57, and it was hidden away for nearly 500 years in the walls.
Correct. Around 525, there was a flood. Edessa had been flooded, and the walls had partially been broken down. And so in repairing the walls, excuse me, in repairing the walls, the shroud and the Keramion were rediscovered. Mm. And then a few years later, probably about 20 years later, Edessa was besieged by a Persian army. And the shroud was brought down to where they were trying to defend against the Persians. And basically, they were trying to set fire to this Persian siege works. Mm. And they couldn't, it was all wet, so they couldn't set it fire. And then they brought the shroud down there and prayed to the shroud. And purportedly, they were able to start the fire. And the siege work was burned. And the Persian army, apparently, a number of the attackers were destroyed or killed by this fire. And so the Persians left. And so the shroud or the Keramion were said to have saved the city.
Which may or may not be true, but the point is the shroud was still in Edessa at that time.
Correct. And they thought it had, okay?
Yeah.
They attributed this to the power of this relic.
Sure.
And so following this, they constructed a church called the Hagia Sophia, which is named after the one in Constantinople, to house and venerate the shroud and the Keramion. And the shroud was shown in public every Easter. But it was shown kind of very in an air of secrecy. You couldn't really see it very well, and mystery. So people didn't really understand it very well, what was happening there.
So to summarize that, 38, the shroud went to Edessa. 57, the shroud was hidden in the walls. 525, after a flood that was rebuilding, the shroud was rediscovered. 544, Edessa successfully repelled the attack of the Persian forces. Yes.
And the shroud was attributed to be the thing that saved them.
Yep.
And they built the church, and they venerated the shroud, and it was shown in public.
And when we know there was something called the image of Edessa.
Correct.
That was present in this copy of the Hagia Sophia church in Edessa.
Now, the shroud at that time was referred to, and particularly back in the days of King Abgar, as the Mandalion. So there's been some dispute as to whether or not the Mandalion and the Shroud were two different things. But I think more or less the conclusion that people have drawn is that the Mandalion and the Shroud were essentially the same object.
And the other thing that's really quite convincing there is if you look at the pictures of Christ in art, of which there are only a few, in, say, the 100s, 200s, 300s, 400s, Christ has got a very Romanesque appearance, short hair,
Correct.
clean shaven. But then in the St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, there's an image of Christ that goes back actually to the mid-550s. It's 6th century, and that's got the characteristic shroud-type appearances that we see in images of Christ after that period of time. So
Correct.
It's very consistent with the rediscovery of the shroud in Edessa in 525. You know, within 25, 50 years after that, there was this image painted that's now in the St. Catherine's Monastery. Which did exist at that time, of course.
Right. And Syriac artists became the main source of Christian art. And of course, the Byzantines later on made many, many icons. And they are basically modeled on either the Shroud or the Keramion.
Yeah.
In terms of the way Christ is pictured.
Yeah. And the detail there is quite revealing. I mean, just for example, the beard has got a gap in the middle of it.
Yep.
Because Isaiah said they plucked my beard. As if part of it had been taken out.
Shroud image, basically. It matches the Shroud image.
Yeah. And I can't remember the details, but you can look at points on the Shroud and points on these early images like the one in St. Catherine's, and you find out there's multiple areas of correlation between the two, which is, again, it's hard to see that these images are not based on the Shroud. It really is quite difficult to see that, and bearing in mind this is in the this is in the 6th century.
And by the way, I should point out here that there have been people who have analyzed exactly what you're talking about. They've analyzed the images of the icons and compared it to the Shroud and point to a lot of the significant the significances in the image, the similarities in the images.
Which is strong evidence that the Shroud existed in the 500s.
Correct.
Now, the Roman Empire divided into the Eastern and Western Empire, from what I remember. The Eastern Empire was centered on... Western Empire was taken over by the Goths and the barbarians, and basically my people, I suppose, took over the Roman Empire, the Roman side. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued on, and it's called Byzantium, headquartered in Constantinople. And there was a Byzantine emperor wanted the image of Edessa, and he sent an army to Edessa.
Yes.
About 944.
Yes, and the Byzantine Empire was periodically threatened by the Turks, and so they had apparently heard about this thing in Edessa that had protected them, and so they sent an army there to conquer Edessa. Edessa made a deal and said, "Listen, we'll give you the Shroud if you leave us alone."
Well, if the alternative's being killed, I think that's probably the whole city being killed. I don't think you mess around with Byzantine emperors.
Correct. So they said, all right, deal. So the Shroud was given to people from Byzantium. It was received with great ceremony, paraded through the city, and sermons were preached. We actually have a copy of the sermon that was preached on that day by a priest by the name of Gregory Referendus, and the Shroud was put in the imperial relic treasury, and we have records of that
in Constantinople.
And what it was folded up, so only the face was visible. It was put like in a reliquary. So normally you would only see the face. I forget now if this was done in Byzantium or just in Edessa. What they would do on Easter time is they would gradually reveal the whole Shroud, one step at a time or one day at a time, until you saw the whole thing. And it was periodically presented to private audiences in Constantinople.
Yeah. And of course, whether the Shroud does have mystical powers to protect cities, of course, is an irrelevance. The point is that this is the historical movement of this image of Edessa.
That's what they believe.
The only debate really is whether this is the Shroud of Turin or not. But there's a lot of indications that it is from the art.
Correct.
So the people of Constantinople were foolish enough to invite knights in from the Fourth Crusade, who they thought were Christian brothers and turned out to be a bunch of thugs. 1204?
Well, yeah. And if you read the history of the Crusades, it's very interesting history. It's amazing that the Crusaders ever conquered Jerusalem in the first place.
Or got that far. Yeah,
they got that far.
Yeah.
That's another story.
The amount of drinking that took place on the way.
Well, it wasn't just the drinking. The main problem, and this is true in 1204 as well, they never had a united leadership.
Yeah.
And so they had all these groups were sort of went their own way, and the leadership would fight with each other. And so there was a complicated politics. The people from the West didn't really trust the people from the East. And so they wound up when they came in the Fourth Crusade to Constantinople, which was usually the launching off point of getting down to Jerusalem, rather than actually going on to Jerusalem, they conquered Constantinople, and they sacked the city, and the Shroud was taken by the Crusaders.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is the start. 1205, 1206, 1207 was the start of the Holy Grail stories.
Yeah, go on.
And we can maybe talk about this later. I don't want to, interrupt this thing, but there was a guy who was a priest. A priest of one of the knights who was from the time of the 1204 Crusade. When this guy got back home to France, that's when these stories started. The stories about the Holy Grail and the blood of Christ, and Joseph of Arimathea catching the blood of Christ through the Grail and so forth. So I personally think the Shroud had something to do with the Grail. We can talk about that later.
But of course, the Shroud did catch the blood, didn't it?
It did. The Shroud has the blood of Christ on it.
If it's genuine, yeah.
Correct.
Absolutely, it's a blood of a crucified man, for sure. Okay, right. 1204 to 1355, things go a bit vague, don't they, at that stage?
Yes, because what happens is that the Shroud is taken by the Crusaders, and there is some documentary evidence of what happened, but it's not necessarily conclusive, and doesn't cover the whole period.
It looks like the Templars took it to Athens, the Knights Templar.
Well, it was taken by this knight, Othon de la Roche. And I believe he was a knight. He was a Templar knight from the Burgundy region of France.
Yeah.
And he actually he was granted this as a result of his participation in the Crusades. He was granted to be the Lord of Athens in Greece. And so the Shroud was probably brought to Greece for a while.
And there is Greek pollen on it, I believe.
Yeah, that may be. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah,
but you may have. That may be true. Eventually, what happens is the Shroud comes to Besançon, which is the capital of Burgundy.
So modern day France.
Back to France. Yeah, and Othon de la Roche, I think he died a little while after that, and his I think he was buried back in France. So I think all of his remains and everything comes back to France, to Burgundy.
And of course, a lot of the Crusaders were Franks, the groups that later became French and German. Yeah,
exactly, they were. In fact, the lead guy who became the king of Jerusalem was from Belgium. Actually, he was at that time was France, really.
Anyway, the Balian, yeah.
Yes. Anyway, in any case, the Shroud eventually becomes the property of a Knight Templar whose name is Geoffrey de Charnay.
And this is round about when? This is around about 13.
It's around about the 1340s to the 1350s.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, he had been captured by the English.
Yeah.
He was a Templar, and he was also very, very high up in the he was a high counselor to King John of France. And I think John may have actually ransomed him from England.
John
or
II,
participated in his John II. And so he builds this chapel in his province, which is Lirey, France. I've actually been there to see this chapel to commemorate his rescue. And then he and his wife Jean displayed the shroud to the public in 1355 in this chapel.
Yeah.
And they mint these medallions, some of which have been found. They found it, by the way, when they drained the Seine River in Paris.
It was in the mud, wasn't it?
It was in the mud. And they found, I think, one or two of them. And this was minted during that time to commemorate the display of the shroud.
Which was typical of pilgrimages during that time.
Yes.
There would be a memento issued.
Right. And, of course, the benefit to whoever owned the shroud or whoever owned the church was that people would come there and pay money to see this thing.
Yeah.
So this is, again, this whole artifact thing.
Yeah, so I mean, very often that would be apostles' toenails and other ludicrous things, but this one is different.
Correct. Or it was pieces of the true cross, things like that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go on. After that, we're talking about documented history, really, aren't we? So from 1355, we're virtually, well, as certain as we can be of the provenance.
Right. Now in 1389, this is another example of things that people have used to basically debunk the shroud. There was this bishop, his name was Pierre Darcis, who was Bishop of Troyes, or Troyes, as it's pronounced in French. And he wrote what's known as the Darcis Memorandum, in which he complained to the Pope that the shroud in Lirey was a painting and a fake. And but what was finally determined was that he had never actually seen the shroud, and he was jealous of Lirey because what had happened was there had been an accident in his cathedral that had destroyed his relics, so people weren't coming to visit his cathedral in Troyes, and so he's saying, all these people are going over to Lirey, and I'm missing all this money. So this memorandum has sort of been questioned and debunked as basically thinking that the shroud has been forged.
So he wasn't very happy that the money was going to Lirey rather than Troyes.
Yeah, and by the way, Clement actually forbade him from actually attacking the shroud, and gave new authorizations to display the shroud later on. Interesting. So it seemed to be that Clement thought that the shroud was actually the shroud of Christ.
The Pope at the time, yeah.
The Pope at the time, Pope Clement the Seventh.
Yeah, and then it's passed down through the generations to Margaret de Chardonnay. What does she come into the story?
Well, she's the granddaughter of Geoffrey, and she allowed the cloth, which of course was still a part of their family, to be viewed on a number of occasions during the period of 1400 to 1453. And then in 1454, she sold the shroud to Duke Louis of Savoy. And the sale of the shroud was actually detailed in a document that's in the Paris archives. So we have the detail of the shroud being sold in 1464. And then later on, there was a history of the Savoy family that recorded that Louis's acquisition of the shroud was his greatest achievement. So here you have more documentary evidence of the shroud, in that period of time.
And then it was passed on down through various generations of the Savoys, periodically displayed. Right.
And the Savoys actually got involved with the politics of Italy. They later became the kings of Italy. They built they built churches. They brought the shroud with them. They displayed it, and finally, the shroud was moved to Turin, Italy, in 1578. And then in 1694, the shroud was placed in the Guarini Chapel in Turin, where it remains even today.
So it had been in Turin since 1578, and it's been in its current home since
1694.
1694, yeah.
Right.
But definitely in Turin since 1578.
Right. So a few other significant dates. These really don't affect the shroud itself, but significant to the scientific analysis of the shroud. 1898 was the first photograph of the shroud, when it was noticed that it was a negative image. 1902 was the first medical examination of the shroud that was done at the Sorbonne by Yves de Laga and his associates. By the way, when he looked at the shroud, he said his conclusion was that this had to be Jesus.
Yes.
Or it had to at least be a man that was crucified in exactly the same way that Jesus had been.
Either way, it's horrific, isn't it? Either Christ was crucified as the Gospels and the Shroud indicate, or the only way to fake this would be to crucify another man.
Correct.
In exactly the same way, because the medical details, for example, the flow of blood on the arm, was characteristic of that which would be the crucifixion, the movement of the body to try and facilitate breathing when the arms are in an upright position. And I think by 1902, anatomy was a well elucidated subject by that time.
Oh yes, very well elucidated.
Yeah.
So then the shroud was actually reviewed a number of times, but in 1978. The Catholic Church finally allowed a team in to really do an extensive series of tests on the shroud, and that's when they determined the characteristics of the image, how fine the image was, that it only covered the first layer of the linen, and so they demonstrated that it really could not have been an artwork. It wasn't a painting, it wasn't a photograph, or any of these other artistic techniques. Then you have, then we forward to 1983, Umberto II, who was the ex-king of Italy, and he was still the legal owner of the shroud, because he was part of the Savoy family. He died.
Right, okay.
All right?
Yeah.
And in his will, he bequeathed the shroud to the Pope and to the successors of the Pope, essentially to the Catholic Church, to the Vatican. But he stipulated that it had to remain in Turin. So the shroud is still in Turin to this day. Then, of course, we have the 1988 dating, which we discussed already. And then in 2002, this is a very interesting occurrence that happened here. A man by the name of Philip Dayvault, who was very interested in early artifacts of Syrian origin, comes to this museum in Edessa and finds down in their archives in the basement what seems to be the Keramion, which was this. The Keramion again was this. It was like a mosaic face that was done of this shroud picture, and put up at the time in Edessa, way back, and by Abgar.
Like the deity that guards the city, sort of thing, as the culture was at the time. Yeah.
Yes, and also the Keramion may have been the model for the artwork that was done, either the shroud or the Keramion. And then the kind of the latest thing that's relevant to the shroud was 2022, when threads of the shroud were dated with this new X-ray technology that I was referred to, wax, and dated it to the time of Christ. And so that sort of includes the historical analysis.
Yeah, and when the Pope allows, there's lots of tests just waiting to be done. I know there's people chomping at the bit to do further tests. Hopefully they will be allowed. So, looking straight at the listener, what do you make of this? It's not the sort of thing that can be poo-pooed or say, "Oh, never mind, let's go for a drink."
Right.
It demands an opinion.
Right.
So, any thinking person has to give an opinion on this.
Right. The bottom line question is, what produced the image on the shroud?
Yeah.
And why have no other burial cloths in the history of the world ever had a similar image imprinted on them?
Yep.
And that's a question that any intelligent person, a thinking person, has got to answer.
Yep. And I've certainly never seen anything like it, nor any medic I've ever talked to seen anything like it, nor any mortician I've ever talked to seen anything like it. Or is there anything else in the whole history of archaeology that's anything
Correct.
anything
Right.
like it? Rich, that was a incredible, concise. Well, I say concise. It's an hour and a half, but I think we did pretty well to cover it in that time. It really is a challenge, and you get the feeling. I kind of get the feeling that this is, there's something in the scriptures called the image of the evidence of Jonah, isn't there? The idea that there's things about the shroud that could only be discovered with the technology of the time, and if the shroud is genuine, things that will only be discovered in the future with the technology of the time,
right.
with improving technology. And
Right.
if this image is genuinely the image of Christ, then that presents a challenge to all of mankind, doesn't it?
It does. And although we need to repeat this, we can't prove this scientifically, prove that this is the burial cloth of Christ. I believe that the evidence for the authenticity of the shroud is overwhelming. I don't see how it can be disputed, frankly.
No, as you say, if it's a forgery, it's a miracle in its own right.
Right.
It really is the most amazing document, and the consistency with the Sudarium of Oviedo is also really quite interesting. That both should survive. On that note, I'm just going through all this again. It just blows you away every time, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. You look at this and you're kind of in awe of saying, "Whoa,
Yeah,
whoa, it's amazing."
yeah,
And then what's even more amazing is to consider not only the birth of Christ but the death of Christ. And the Bible says that Jesus is the designer of creation; he's the King of Kings. But his birth, we don't even know exactly when he was born. We think now that it was maybe 2 BC.
2 or 3 probably. Yeah.
That's in debate.
Well, Herod the Great actually died in about 4 BC, so it could have been even a year or two before that.
Yes, so that's up for grabs.
Yeah.
His death takes place in haste. They bury him in haste. He's buried in poverty. The whole thing is done in obscurity and a total lack of ceremony. They basically rush him into the grave, cover him up with this cloth, and they don't even have time to wash him or properly anoint him. And so it sort of goes along with the fact that even though Jesus is the King of Kings, he says, I'm here to serve you. I'm not here to be served. And so the shroud is kind of the testimony to both his humanity and his humility, as well as to his divinity.
Yeah, the miraculous image of a crucified man, and of course the idea is that the body on the image is clearly dead with the rigor mortis, but yet the body appears to have been this immense source of the energy that somehow transferred the image of the body onto that shroud. And some people have said that this could be the very moment of, I mean, we can't demonstrate this scientifically, but it's not inconsistent with the idea of that energy source being the physical correlation of the resurrection itself. That it is consistent with that idea. Right.
And that seems to be the only explanation, the only realistic explanation for this.
Well, as I say, I've been studying the Shroud now for about a year. I had heard of it, of course, way back in the Stirp times, in the late 70s. And thinking about how that image got there quite intensely and talking to others about it over the past year, no one else can come up with any explanation of how that image got there other than a very short burst of very intense radiation that relayed negative and three-dimensional information from the body imprinted onto the shroud. It's really hard to think of any alternative explanation for that.
Well, there's some people that allege that it was a chemical reaction, but I myself would agree with you. I think that the most realistic explanation is that it was radiation at the time of the resurrection.
A chemical would be vapors, there would be diffusion. It wouldn't be so high resolution because the shroud is a very high resolution, precise image.
Yes, and that's why I can't go along with that chemical explanation.
No.
I think it has to be radiation, but that's my opinion.
Yep. Rich, thank you so much. Clearly done a lot of work on that, very concisely laid out. We appreciate that, and many others appreciate it also. So thank you so much for your time. And
I'm happy to be of service, and I'm glad to be here. And I salute you for your past, for what you've done and what you will be doing. If you're interested in reading more of my articles, there's some of them are on Shroud.com. They're also on academia.edu, my own website, richardsorensen.com. And I've started doing my own videos too. I have a site called, or a YouTube channel rather, called Biblical Mysteries Explained. So you can see more of my stuff there.
And we'll certainly put the links to that.
Very good.
And you obviously you're welcome to put this video up there as well if you want to.
Well, thank you.
I will send you a high resolution copy, but for now, Rich, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. God bless you.
And God bless you, and God bless everyone watching.